Hello and welcome to Transplant's Take on Sport. My name's Lewis Daniels and today I'm joined by Ray Sherry, a triathlete and recent liver transplant recipient. Ray chats to me about his experience with primary sclerosing cholangitis and how he used diet and exercise to manage the condition, showing his positive outlook on life throughout. Ray's positive attitude has continued until this day, helping him deal with having a transplant during a global pandemic and taking a keen interest in his recovery to help him reach his sporting goals for the future. So make sure you stick around to hear more from another inspirational guest. If you're enjoying the podcast, please make sure you press subscribe or follow wherever you normally listen so you don't miss an episode. And if you'd like to follow the podcast on social media, all the links will be in the show notes. Ray Sherry, welcome to Transplant's Take on Sport.
Yeah, thanks, Lewis. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you on. I think it's going to be a unique and slightly different take to what we've had on the podcast before today. You are a very recent liver transplant recipient and actually had your transplant during the pandemic, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about later on in the podcast. But to start with, we're actually going to go right back to the start. And when you first found out that you or your liver wasn't quite right. So you sent me some information this week. And so I've read a bit when you were diagnosed. When did you first find out that there was something wrong with your liver?
Well, I think it goes back quite a long time, actually. In 2005, I was on a trip to South Africa with some friends to follow England, to follow the Barmy Army in Cape Town. And it was the first time England had played South Africa since apartheid. In fact, I'd seen the previous match in London, and this was the return game. So we all flew down to Cape Town, and we had a great time, as you can imagine, with the Barmy Army.
Good characters.
And I had a sort of a separate flight back to London, and jumped on that flight. Was feeling absolutely fine. Had a stopover in Abu Dhabi. Decided to go for a massage, and strange thing was when the massage started, I began to feel a little bit nauseous and felt really uncomfortable. And then it was a case of getting on the flight. Got on the flight and things just went downhill to the point where I really wanted just to get off the flight. Of course, you can't do that when you're in midair. And sort of I implored the staff on the flight to sort of help me in some way, but they were just unable to do anything really. So I had to bear it until I got back to London. And then when I got back to London, I had to get back to Northampton, where I was living at the time. And things were still deteriorating at that time. I was just feeling really, really ill. I had jaundiced in that 24-hour period, so it was very, very quick. I went to Northampton General Hospital that evening, and they didn't really know what it was, to be honest with you, because I'd said I'd been in South Africa. They thought it was yellow fever or some other condition. And they didn't know what to do or how to treat it. They gave me some antibiotics and put me through some tests, but concluded nothing. And it wasn't until the May of that year, so 5 months later, that one of the consultant doctors was able to put his finger on it, and he said immediately it was primary sclerosing cholangitis. It was PSC. And he immediately treated it with 2 sets of antibiotics. And shortly afterwards, within about 2 weeks, I was feeling much better. And the jaundice had much improved as well. The bilirubin count, which most people will know about from a liver transplant perspective, will know that bilirubin is obviously the count that goes up as you become jaundiced and will go down as you become less jaundiced. So it took 5 months to diagnose. And in that time, I'd lost something like 16 kilos in weight.
It's quite a lot.
Didn't hurt me to lose that weight. In fact, it was quite good. I mean, I had come down something like 3 short trouser sizes in that time, so that was good. I was living on yogurt and cup of soups for nearly 4 or 5 months, but it was the only thing I could keep down.
Was that because of the condition? And for those who aren't aware, would you be able to describe a bit about the condition, which I'm not going to try and pronounce, so I'll leave that to the expert.
Okay, yeah, primary sclerosing cholangitis. That it comes from, at least the science and the data suggest that it comes from ulcerative colitis. I had ulcerative colitis when I was age 17. I was attacked through salmonella food poisoning. It affected the colon. It causes an inflammation of the colon. I recovered from that after about 6 weeks, and then it was years later that I got salmonella food poisoning again, unfortunately, following a Christmas dinner at work, and that hospitalized me. And things were really quite bad at the time. So the inflammation of the colon finds its way into the liver. It's called sclerosing into the liver, and effectively what it does is it causes the liver to scar and narrows the biliary ducts within the liver itself, affecting the flow of the bile through the liver, and therefore over time it begins to sort of slow down. Occasionally it would build up and infect, and then I would end up in hospital having sort of IV antibiotics for a period of time and then be released after 4 or 5 days.
All right, okay. And was only having cup of soup and yogurt because that was all you could keep down, or
Yeah, I mean, that's all it really felt like eating and drinking at that time. So that during that 5 months period, that's all my appetite was really up for. But after I'd been treated with antibiotics, my appetite returned quite quickly, and pretty much every day since I've had a good appetite. I've been very fortunate to just be able to continue managing the condition for the last 16 years, basically, by just being sensible about sort of what I drink, and exercising, which was some of the best advice I was given very early on. In terms of the first time it was mentioned to me that I might need a liver transplant, was when I had a distended gallbladder, effectively an inflammation of the gallbladder caused by gallstones, which also caused a certain amount of jaundice. And at that time, they were talking about whipping out that gallbladder, but also considering me for a transplant. And that goes back as far as 2009. That was the first time that it was mentioned. I was living in Poole, beautiful Poole at the time, and I was referred up to King's College London, under the specialist liver team there, and that's when I had the first conversation about a possible transplant. It was predicted at the time, and that's all the data that was available then, was somewhere between 7 and 10 years from diagnosis. So I was already diagnosed 4 years earlier, and therefore it was somewhere between 3 and 5 years before I would need a liver transplant from that time.
compared to the other liver transplant recipient guests that I've had on the podcast so far, you knew you'd need a transplant a long time before they did. They were in the well, less than 2 weeks. One 2 days, one 12 days. How did you manage your condition for so long? And did sport play a part in that? Like I know from the information you've sent me that you were a talented athlete, you represented Wales under 20s in long jump and triple jump before you were diagnosed. Did that sporting talent and the love for sport continue throughout the time you were diagnosed and living with the condition?
Yes, it did. In fact, the best advice I was given by Kings at the time was to stay fit and stay healthy. And I felt that since I wasn't a doctor, since I wasn't a consultant or a surgeon, the best thing that I could do really was to follow the path of fitness. So I took up cycling in 2000, and I took it up in 2008 anyway, because I thought being healthier whilst having a condition was probably a good thing to do. But it was reinforced by the consultant at King's College Hospital um, in 2009, and I've just continued to exercise ever since. Now, the condition itself, and some people will already know this, is that you end up developing pruritus, which is a sort of an itching caused by the extra salts in your blood system, and that's for me was probably the most difficult thing to manage over the last 16 years. And what did I do? Well, keeping the skin cool, wearing clothes that weren't too tight, were fairly loose, um, allowed the air to circulate around the skin. Cycling was ideal for it because it got you out in the fresh air and it allowed the air to pass over the body. In fact, the cooler the day, the better, actually.
Yeah.
I also took up swimming. and again that really helped, and kept the skin cool. But it was also a question of not wearing too many clothes, um, using moisturizer. I must have tried every moisturizer in the world, in terms of trying to cool the skin down. But the one thing that really worked for me was the Brute's own brand, Sultan, with the aloe vera, and I just applied that to the skin, especially the areas where it's particularly warm and hot, and that sort of had a calming effect. But all of this was really decided by me. There was no advice back in 2008, 2009 about how to manage the condition. There certainly wasn't any dietary advice, from my recollection, and it was a question of sort of finding my own way. And then once I had found a way, it was a question of living according to that way, and not forgetting that certain foods would trigger the condition. Just being in hot environments would trigger the condition. Not putting moisturizer on would trigger a condition, or just sort of exacerbate the symptoms that came about from the PSC. Sport did play a huge part in that, because it got me out, stopped me thinking about, my condition wasn't going to hold me back in terms of trying to live a fairly normal life. So sport, the cycling especially, and then I moved into swimming and then running. I didn't really get into the swimming and running seriously until 2015. I was actually in the Maldives on holiday, and there was a beautiful swimming pool in front of me, and I thought to myself, well, I'm enjoying my cycling, but it's only doing good to my lower body. It's only sort of strengthening the legs. It's not doing an awful lot for my upper body, and I really needed to have something that was much more rounded. So I decided at that time, to the humor of my friends, that that I would do triathlons, and I would start slow, and I would eventually move into doing some go tries, which are the early stage triathlons before moving into sprint triathlons. And to this day, I still believe that being fit, and healthy is the best thing that you can do as an individual to ready yourself, because you've got to put your hands into the hands of the medical professionals and your GP, etc. But the best thing you can do is stay fit and healthy.
Exercising is so important as has been to me as well. And I think what you've talked about there shows the determination that yourself and many other transplant patients or people with long term conditions have to take control. I've said it before on the podcast, to take control of their illness rather than the illness controlling you. And just through this, all the sports you've taken up there, I didn't want to break your flow, but a few things that I picked up on. So doing triathlon and trying to keep yourself cool and certain foods triggering the condition. So there's going to be a few things here. When you're cycling, trying to keep your body cool and wearing the right clothing, does that mean that you wore something different to the lycra that you might see a lot of cyclists wear nowadays? I'm not a cyclist, so I don't know if that is cooling or not. I know you can get keep cool base layers, that sort of thing. And on the dietary side, with certain foods that cause flare up, did that affect how you prepared for sport in a sense of eating the right things to give you energy for the day in the full race?
Well, in terms of the clothing, not I didn't really wear anything different. I think where some people might have chosen to put on two layers because of the temperature, I would just put one on. And so, because putting on layers traps the air, as most people know, that you get that heat, a little sort of layer of air which warms up and keeps you warm. I didn't particularly like that, and it just made me warmer than I needed to be. But I just wore one layer in most cases. Well, whilst other people, when it was 12 degrees, were probably wearing two or three layers, I was just wearing one layer. Um, in terms of food, I think that the biggest challenge was volume. I mean, I've always had a great appetite, and even up until my transplant, my appetite was pretty good. But it was a question of volume, and trying to sort of keep down on things like the saturated fats and anything that was really sugar based. So I went from eating a fairly healthy volume of food to about half that, before I went in for my transplant, mainly because the liver just wasn't functioning very well at all, and its ability to handle sort of the higher volume, it was struggling basically, and it was just causing more and more symptoms, highlighting those symptoms even more, compared with a lower volume of food that sort of just allowed me to manage that sort of impact.
I noticed this when my kidneys were deteriorating, and I wonder if you did with your liver. But as you got closer to your transplant and your liver function reduced, did you find it more difficult to keep going with sport and keep your energy to the level it needed to be and fitness level to the level it needed to be to, in your case, compete in triathlons?
Well, my first triathlon was in 2005. I did the Cardiff Triathlon, a sprint triathlon. Um, the swim went really well because it was in Cardiff Bay. It was nice and cool, and the cycle went really well, and the run went really well. The thing that didn't go really well is it took me almost 2 hours to get round. So that in itself was an experience, but it wasn't about going fast. It was just about getting around. Um, but then I progressed steadily from sprint distance up to standard Olympic distance, and I did that in, I think it was 2019, October 2019, incidentally on the hottest day of the year, down at Eton Dorney, just outside London. And the thing I found about that was that the heat became a bit of a problem for me because of the symptoms of PSC, and I struggled when I got onto the run. I mean, a lot of people struggled anyway because it was a hot day, but I seemed to struggle more. But last year, um, I was still pushing myself. I'd already done 3 half marathons at the start of the year. I was lining myself up to do Ironman Wales in September, and had effectively planned out my whole year. So I never for a moment thought that I should let the condition take over my life. Basically, it was more a case of me pushing myself and taking that control and staying with it. As long as my body was able to do it, I did it. Where things changed was in November of last year, where I certainly felt physically different, and I looked different because I began to jaundice. The liver function had begun to deteriorate, and it was only then, after doing a 125-mile bike ride in September, did I actually begin to feel that it was getting harder and harder and harder, to the point where running became more of a slog rather than an enjoyment, something that I enjoyed doing. And eventually, the running I had to stop because it just became too difficult. But up until the weekend before the transplant, I was still cycling 30, 40 miles on a regular basis. So I think that sort of kept my mind off what would be quite a life changing day when the transplant came, and it just allowed me to continue to do my piece or my part of getting ready for what would be a big day.
Credit to you as well for doing that. I noticed similarities in what you're saying there uh, between what you did and what I did, just trying to keep it going as long as your body could do it. I've said before on here that I was playing cricket up to quite close, and running did become a slog. Running to chase the ball or going out for a run to try and keep fit was just getting harder and harder. And you've done some in there, some great achievements, cycling 125 miles, training for an Ironman. What would you say? I mean, this is going to be before your transplant. Um, you've not had much chance, to be fair, to do much sport after your transplant. What would you say has been your greatest sporting achievement or your sporting highlights over the years?
Well, I've been very lucky because a lot of my early life, I had some really, really enjoyable times with, being cross country champion for the schools in Cardiff, being Wales schools champion at long jump and triple jump. So all of those were fantastic days. But, wind the clock forward 30, 40 years, back to 2010, where I had this great idea. Well, I don't know if it was a great idea, but it turned out to be a great idea of getting a team of people together to cycle from Land's End to John O'Groats and raise money for Macmillan Cancer Support. I was working with Barclays at the time, and I think it was the day before Christmas Eve, before we broke up for the holiday period, I sent out a message to everybody in the corporate organization asking for interested parties, and I got 39 people came back almost within 20 minutes. saying, yeah, I'd be interested. That eventually got whittled down to 12 when the reality dawned about the amount of training that would be required by everyone to get to a level where you could even start, never mind finish. But in August 2010, we assembled a team of 12 people in Land's End, and with support, we started to cycle, and we cycled for 10 days, 100 miles a day. And we got to John O'Groats those 10 days later. And on the final day, we got a gale. We got a gale on the north coast of Scotland, whereas the previous 9 days we had enjoyed pretty nice weather. In fact, we had wind from the east rather than from the southwest. Hence why people would normally start in the southwest, because they'd be getting sort of prevailing southerly winds to help them go north. But on that particular period, we had winds from the east, which weren't too bad. But it was only on the last day that we had a John Amos storm, and there was gales blowing right into our head, into our faces. And at one stage, we were doing updates on Twitter, and we had to call out a crash. There was a big crash on that last day, and 5 of the guys ended up in a ditch. They were blown sideways into a ditch and got themselves out. Thankfully, they weren't going that quick because the wind was so strong. But they got out of the ditch, and they finished the event. And 12 of us started and 12 of us finished. We drove back down to Aberdeen that evening, and we had a big party, stayed overnight, and went back to our respective homes. So for me, that was my personal greatest achievement. But I also take some additional pride in the fact that we got everyone around voluntarily. There was nothing compulsory about this. It was all voluntary, and there's some you find out about yourself when you do things voluntarily and you push yourself to the extreme level. You find out things about yourself, is you need to let people get through that sort of mental challenge that you get when you're pushing yourself to the extreme level. Um, yeah, for me, that was probably it. Um, and anybody that knows cycling knows that, to get up to 100 miles as well is like a major achievement. Get over 100 miles is, even better. So I've done that probably a dozen times now, besides the Land's End Joan O'Groats. And that's something I really enjoy. That is a challenge. That really is.
It's a brilliant achievement, and it make even more so with the effects of the condition that you've spoken about already, and being able to lead a team up there. The mental strength it takes, I'm sure, will have helped you in your journey through liver failure and the transplant, which we'll come on to now. Do you think it helped that you had a long time to prepare for a transplant?
I think it did, in the sense that I I knew it was going to happen one day. Okay, there was really no doubt about that. I didn't know when it was going to happen, and I certainly wouldn't have chosen to do it in the middle of a pandemic, if anyone had asked me. Um, but it allowed me to do lots of my own research and learn about transplants, learn about before, during, and after, as well as the brilliant education packs that I got from the Royal Free in the lead up to the transplant. It allowed me just to sort of effectively coast through life as best I could, and I think it did give me like an edge. It gave me time to prepare. Um, you know, take 10 years to get a level of fitness that most people at my age would be really envious about. I think that was the thing that I think gave me a lot of confidence going into the transplant. The fact that I had prepared myself in a very very good way, and I couldn't do any. I don't think I could have done any more, to be honest with you. Um, yeah, yeah. Well, I think those things are the sort of things that sort of kept me focused.
How long were you actually on the waiting list for a liver?
Well, that in itself it was an incredible thing, really, because there were very strong signs of deterioration in October, and then November. I went to I went to the Royal Free for an assessment. I think it was the 14th and 15th of December last year, and I was put on the transplant list a week later. So very similar to others that have been on a podcast before, that things happen very quickly once the liver got to a certain stage. But I'd had 14, 15 years prep prior to that just to get myself fit, really. And I think a lot of people perhaps didn't get that or haven't got that. and I was very lucky in that respect.
Was a live donor ever discussed? Because I know livers can come from living people. Was that ever an option for you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I have quite an extensive family, so there was always potential to go for a live donor. Um, the question was really about whether it was the right thing to do during a pandemic, and the advice that I was given at the time was that it probably wouldn't be a good idea during a pandemic to take part of the liver from a living donor
Yeah.
because they would have to be hospitalized as well for a period of time, and that probably wasn't the right thing to do. I did have a moral dilemma myself about whether I could take putting a member of my family through that type of trauma. Um, and happily in the end, I didn't really need to do that. For want of a better way of putting it, but it was put on the table. It was briefly discussed, but I took it off the table fairly quickly.
I think that's understandable as well. A lot of people don't want to put somebody else through that experience. I mean, with the COVID situation as well, with meaning an extra person in hospital, possibly more risk there. How did you cope with the delays due to COVID?
Well, again, I think I was really quite lucky. When I was put on the transplant list, I knew that I was well prepared in the sense that I was informed by the transplant coordinators that there would be a number of potential false alarms. I would get called, and for whatever reason, things wouldn't go ahead. That did happen to me once. I was called up to London, hung around for 12 hours, and then the transplant was called off for several reasons. At one stage, Royal Free actually shut down its transplant unit for I think it was for a couple of weeks because of the pandemic. And at that time, the only transplant unit that was open in the UK, I think, was Newcastle. So I was transferred to the Newcastle list and had to go and be assessed by those guys. And I travelled up on a Wednesday, stayed overnight, and then in the snow crossing the peaks, I went across to Newcastle and went in, had a great assessment and a great day at Newcastle. They were amazing. Um, and then 3 or 4 days later, I was put back on the Royal Free list. So it was almost like I was sort of enjoying the trips to London and up to Newcastle, meeting people, discussing the condition, and because I was more focused on the upside of a transplant rather than sort of the worry side of it, which is how am I going to recover? Am I going to get through this? Whatever. And I never for a moment thought that I wouldn't get through it. Never.
I think that's a good way to look at it as well, thinking of all the positives that you can take from it. And the question that we've managed to get half an hour, nearly half an hour in, and I haven't asked yet, when it did go ahead in March, did it all go smoothly?
Very much so. Yes,
Good
very
to
much
hear.
so. Yeah, I still hung around for 12 hours, but there is, as most people will know, there's a lot of prep involved. And of course, you have to think about the donor and the donor's family and what they're going through at that time. And the fact that the donor needs to be prepared. And at the time, the liver, I believe, was coming from the north of England, and it had to be prepared and it had to be transported down to London. And at any time, something could have gone wrong, but thankfully it didn't, and it went ahead very smoothly. And I remember being updated by the liver transplant coordinators almost every 2 hours. They were coming round and speaking to me. I was the only one in the actual ward unit. There was 6 beds, but I was the only one in there. I'm not sure if that was COVID or just because they didn't like me or whatever, but I'm sure it was because of COVID. The amount of isolation and treatment and care that was taken was incredible. Um, but yeah, they would come around every 2 hours, update me, and it was on the 12th hour that they came and said, "We've got the green light. Let's go." And I remember walking down with I'm trying to remember the name of the coordinator, Kate, walking down to the operating theatre like it was like we were just going out for to the shop or something like that, and got down into level 3, I think it was, in the Royal Free, and sat there just having a chat with an anaesthetist. Up until that time, I hadn't given a single thought really to the transplant and the operation. I deliberately steered my mind completely away from it because I think if I'd started to think about it, then I would have started to worry about it, and that would have pushed my blood pressure up, my pulse up, and would have got me in a sort of a worse state. And I guess I used my power of mental focus just to steer away from thinking about it. And really, the only time I thought about it was talking to the anaesthetist because I could see into the operating theatre. I could see the table, and after 10 minutes chatting outside, checking all the labels and so forth, we went in and I laid on the table and looked around and asked questions about the technology and how things are going because I have a technology background and I'm curious about technology, especially in medicine. And we were having a good chat, and he said, "Well, we're just going to prep you and send you off to sleep." And within about 5 minutes, I was asleep, and I came around and don't remember a damn thing, not a thing.
It's a strange experience going into the operating theatre and going under, and again, the mental strength you've shown to not think about the actual operation is really admirable. I was thinking about it a long time up until that. As soon as it found out it was happening, it was right. Okay, this could happen. This could happen. Not the right way to be, but I suppose you deal with it in your own way. Once you'd had the transplant, how did it affect your fitness?
Well, with a 22-inch scar or wound across my abdomen, I think the first thing that I found very difficult, again, most people would find, is just the ability to move. Not even step forward, but just to move around in bed,
Yeah,
and then sort of take that first step, which is to ease yourself onto the side of the bed, and then eventually ease yourself onto the floor and start walking. So I think once I'd managed to do that without any real assistance, it was a question of just sort of gradually walking that little bit more. So and being careful about walking into things, being careful about walking too close to people because they might walk into you. So very, very conscious of things like that, and just taking my time to do everything. Really, almost robotic, to be honest with you, in those early few hours after the operation. Just being very careful and doing things very, very slowly. But once I was out of bed, it was a question of how many laps can I do of the ward? How many Ks can I get in that day? And gradually went from walking around once to twice to 5 to 10 to 15 to 20. And I think in one day, about a week later, I had got up to 5K just walking around the ward. Um, so it was just a question for me of bearing in mind that I had just had a huge life changing operation, just taking my time and building back the fitness slowly that I was advised to do, and not trying to do anything that might stretch me at that stage. And I thought walking's a very natural thing to do, and therefore, if I can do it, I should do it. Eventually, I progressed onto the steps that are also in the ward, and started doing those several times a day as well. And that just built confidence and just got me moving again.
and once you got out of the hospital, how did you take your recovery to the next level and step it up a bit from there? I mean, doing 5K in the wards is great. It's something that I never even thought to do, and probably didn't have the confidence to do at that point. But how did you take the next step once you got home again?
Um, well, to be honest with you, I've never really liked walking. I've always preferred running, cycling, or swimming. So walking, because it's something you do sort of naturally. I never really took to it as a like an activity. More a thing that you do just to get to the car, or the thing that you do to get onto the bicycle. But I started to walk more. I got outside in the fresh air, and just started to walk on a daily basis. Um, and I didn't really set myself any specific target about how far I should walk, but I just started walking around the block of where I live, and then going to one of the local beauty spots, walking down to that, and walking around the lake, a place called Roth Park, where there was a stimulus where the birds hang out in terms of the swans and the geese and the ducks and all. So it's a beautiful area, and using sort of a bit of nature to sort of settle my mind, and make it interesting in terms of a walk. And I think that was really, really beneficial. And then when I could drive again, I was able to go down more frequently, and maybe do a couple of laps of that lake. So it was a question of just gradually building, and not trying to extend myself too much, not doing any hills for at least a couple of weeks until after I got home, and then gradually building hills in. Because hills I thought were quite taxing early on, not least because they were just putting me out of breath, but also they were sort of stretching my abdomen in a way that I wasn't feeling comfortable about, really. So yeah, I just continued on walking to the point where I could get in the car and then get on the bike again.
I think a lot of people in our position, transplant recipients, immunosuppressed, have all taken up walking in the last 15 months, especially. You more recently since your transplant. What's your fitness like now? Now that you're about 12 weeks on?
Yeah, we're just into the 14th week now, and I think my fitness has improved. There's no doubt in terms of um, where it was obviously those those first few days after the operation, um, but it is beginning to highlight some things that I wasn't expecting. So at the weekend, I cycled nearly 80 kilometers across two different days, but that's had a big impact. So yesterday, I didn't do anything basically. I just lounged around and took it easy because the muscles were really quite sore, and it was very akin to cycling 100 miles. That's what it felt like in terms of the impact that that had. So I'm thinking that there might have been some muscle damage before the operation, when in that 4 month period prior to the operation, that I wasn't really cognizant of. But when I started to exercise again and push myself again, that's become more sort of transparent and more visible to me. And that's something I'm going to discuss with the doctors today in my regular checkup. Um, so I've had to stop running for the time being because I think that's just one sport too many at the moment. But I'm going to focus on the cycling and keep that going and be a little bit be a little bit more sensible for a few more weeks longer, really.
We had a chat before recording, messages backwards and forwards to try and work out when we are going to do this and get some extra information on what we're going to talk about. And you mentioned, as a triathlete, a little bit of the goals you've got short term, the challenges you're doing at the moment on the bike and a running one. Do you want to tell the listeners a bit about that?
Yeah, so for the bike, my hope is to get up to 50 kilometers in one single ride by the end of this month. Um, I've also got we every year there's a ride from Cardiff to West Wales, what we call the Card 10. It's 108 miles. I did it in 2019. Um, what we're going to do is I'm going to get together some friends. We're going to try and cycle part of that route halfway and then come back. That's 108 miles. I'm going to try and go as far as I can, bearing in mind that I also need to be able to come back as well. So I might do 30 miles out and 30 miles back. There's a dragon ride in a place called Pembury Park in September. That's 100 miles, and it involves going up quite a few hills in the Brecon Beacons. And again, I'm gonna go to it, and I'm gonna have a go at seeing as far as I can get. In terms of running, my intention is to try and get to 5K this year. Um, and I do have a marathon booked, the Newport Marathon entry booked, a carryover from last year. I have that booked. I think it's October the 28th. Um, I'm not expecting to run a marathon this year. I think what I'll do is I'll go and I'll enjoy the atmosphere and the encouragement from the people that will line the streets, and I'll just go as far as I can, really, whether it's 10K or 15K or whatever, and just enjoy it, really enjoy it. And I would like to get prepared for Leeds next year, the Transplant Games next year. And I'm thinking of entering cycling and possibly some track and field as well. I'm thinking of bringing back my triple jump technique from when I was under 20 and maybe giving that a go. My brother advised me to have a go at triple jump. He said the reason why you'd be good at triple jump is because you have technique, whereas somewhere like something like long jump, for example, as long as you have sprint speed and you take off in the right place, you could get distance. Whereas triple jump, you've actually got more chance of success because there's three stages involved, three phases involved, which requires more technique. And I still have the technique from when I was in my late teens. Um, and then hopefully next year, take part in Leeds 22, and ideally then qualify for the World Championships. I think there's a chance. I think anyone that um, enters has a chance of qualifying for the World Championships. And then I plan and hope to go to Perth in 2023 in April, and then turn that into a bit of a tour around that part of the world. Head off to Bora Bora, around to Haiti, Fiji, up to Hawaii, California, New York, and then back to London, and maybe take a couple of months off. I think the one thing that having the transplant has reignited in me is that life is short, and my passion for travel is ever stronger, especially with the pandemic around. And I know that maybe the pandemic may not be cleared around some of the world. In even in 2023, there still may be pockets of the pandemic in different countries that I might visit, but I'm hoping not. I'm hoping it's all gone and everyone in the world has been vaccinated. But that's the plans over the next 18 months, 2 years.
You're clearly very ambitious and you've got a lot of plans there. And I like the fact that you've taken the transplant in your stride. You've got this gift now, the gift of life again. And you're going, right, I can do this, I can do this, I can do that. And the fact you're planning ahead is really good. And Leeds 2022, I think it was either today or yesterday, we've now got confirmed, or I say confirmed, we've got dates that's set to go ahead next year. I know it's been cancelled for the last
Yeah,
2 years,
yeah.
but that is set to go ahead at the end of July next year. So hopefully see you there for my first one as well. And
Well, that'd be great.
I really hope so. And from what I've picked up from speaking to other people who've been to the games, and like you said, there's a chance to qualify for the World Transplant Games the year after, is have a go. Pick a sport you think you might do well in. Pick some sports that you just want to have a go at. Do just enjoy it, embrace it is what I've got a feeling of, and been told by other people who've been. You're someone who's in your recovery stage at the moment, still recovering, still building your fitness back up, and you've done some great things with it. Have you got any tips for other people who are recovering from a transplant in regaining their fitness?
I think this is a tip that I would pass on to anybody, even if you haven't had a transplant, is that you should always listen to your body. By listen to your body, I don't mean that your body's making noises, but your body will react in certain ways depending on how you treat it. So if you're going to run a marathon, you're probably going to have sore knee joints. If you're going to cycle 100 miles, you're probably going to have a bit of sunburn from being outdoors. Um, so listen to your body and adjust what you're doing based on sort of how you're feeling. I think for me, that's something I've followed over the last 16 years since I was diagnosed, but I was even doing that well before. Your body will let you know if it's not up for what you intend to do, and therefore you should take note. I've known many runners over the years that think that doing more running is the way of getting better. Actually, it's a balance between doing the right exercise, changing the nature of that exercise. So if you're always running, you're not always going to improve. Sometimes it's better to run over different terrain, maybe up hills, maybe through a countryside lane or whatever. If you're always running on concrete or tarmac, it's not necessarily going to be something that you can improve upon. But don't forget to give yourself rest, and don't forget to eat and drink in the right way.
I completely agree. Rest's so important, and staying hydrated, especially I know from my point of view as a kidney transplant recipient, staying hydrated is so important. We've talked about the your plans for the future, where you want to go, what you want to compete in. Would you consider doing the Ironman you were training for?
That's a really good question, and it's something I've mulled over in my mind. Um, Certainly not for the next 2 years because I'm in the wrong end of the age group. Um, I think I'll come back to it after 2023, um, and reconsider then, because I think there's enough to focus on over the next 18 months, 2 years without complicating things with an Ironman. It's a substantial amount of training as well that you need to put in, and I've been working towards Ironman Wales for, like, 4 years, and last year I was really getting up to that level. So it's not something that I can take lightly as a decision because the amount of time you need to invest in training for it. But I think I'll put it off for a couple of years and I'll come back to it when I'm in my 60 to 69 age group and give myself more chance of doing better.
I think that's sensible and also quite a clever choice to wait until you're in the next age category at the
Absolutely.
bottom end. Ray, it's been so good to talk to you today, and I think the your mental strength and determination is really admirable, and I think people will take something from that. Final question before we go, and it's the one that I ask everyone at the end of the podcast. What's one piece of advice you'd give to someone facing a transplant, which I think is going to be especially poignant coming from somebody like you who's just had it done?
Yeah, well, um, I think there's probably two pieces of advice really. Don't worry about the transplant. We have amazing professionals, medical professionals in this country. they will do an amazing job, and there's very little you can do to influence the medical side of what they do. So focus on what you can do. And what I did was I focused on my fitness, and I was able to influence that in a very, very good way that put me, I think, in the best place possible to recover well and obviously increase my chances of a successful transplant. So don't worry about the transplant. Don't worry about what you're going to go through. Focus on you and focus on your fitness, and eat reasonably healthily. I think anybody who's suffering from a degraded liver function will know that there's certain foods that they can't really eat, and I would say stick to that, and don't eat things that are going to make you feel unwell. But your fitness level will really help you get through, and therefore try to do your part of the whole transplant process by staying as fit as you can.
There we go. Thanks again to my guest today, Ray Sherry. I've been Lewis Daniels, and you've been listening to Transplant's Take on Sport.